Well, yesterday we made a prediction about the offense and 3 offensive players in particular for the 2025 football season. And I figured, well, how else will we follow that up by then making a prediction about the defense, right? It only stands to reason that, it'd be a 2-part series here. One day we have predictions about the offense. One day we have predictions about the defense. So let's do that today. But instead of doing like yesterday, we had prediction that Eli Holstein's going to throw for 3,000 yards. Des Reed will have 2,000 all-purpose yards, and Kenny Johnson will be a 1,000-yard receiver. So basically, we said that everybody will have great seasons. It's always the best when your prediction is just everybody will go off. That won't blow up in my face at all. And I'm sure there are people out there who wrote that down. That's fine. You can take notes. I'll keep the receipts myself. And when I mess this up, when the hype train goes off the rails, I'll willingly own it. But rather than do that for the defense, I think there's a bigger prediction to make and a more important prediction to make, and it's about the most important element of the defense, where Pitt needs to improve the most from last season to this season on defense, where for the last 2 years, really, Pitt has been not necessarily down bad, but just not as good as they've been in the past and not as good as they need to be. Of course, I'm talking about generating pressure. I'm talking about getting sacks. And so my prediction today is going to be about the defense and the sacks that Pitt will get on defense, either a total number or an average per game. While you listen to the intro music, I'll decide if I'm going to predict the total number or the average per game. But either way, it's going to be a lot. Here on the Thursday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's the Thursday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, hanging out with you today as we get closer to the end of the week. I'll be in the South Side later this morning for training camp practice number whatever it is. They started last week, and they are humming right through camp, and we will be down there for all the coverage. Pat Narduzzi, video and transcript, practice report, photos, interviews, all the kinds of things you expect to get out of Panther-Lair.com's coverage of training camp. We'll be down there to provide it for you. And if you want to get it now, I should mention this, and I should say it more often. Look, if you want the most comprehensive source of training camp coverage, if you want to know everything going on in the South Side, do it right now, because we're giving you an annual subscription for 50% off, like half off. We're giving you twice the coverage that we usually do. Training camp always increases the coverage amount, and we're giving it to you for half off. And look, this is the best time this is the ideal time to get on board with an annual subscription, because you get all the training camp coverage right now. You're on the site throughout the season, so you get our coverage of the team, but you also get the message boards where you can talk during every game. There's nothing more fun, or, depending on your definition of fun, there's nothing more fun than being on the message boards during an away game. It's great. And then you get into basketball season, all the transfer portal and all that stuff. You lock it in for half the cost right now. So go to Panther-Lair.com. You look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see, get an annual subscription for half off. That's a great deal. You should take advantage of it. And then you can get all the content and coverage right now. You can get in the community with the message boards, and you can get locked in for the year at half the cost. What a great deal. Panther-Lair.com. And real quick, of course, we ask you to like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com so you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. All right, let's jump into it. Move on to this conversation about sacks for the Pitt defense. Last year, Pitt had 41 total sacks. They averaged 3.15 sacks per game, which ended up being tied for 6th nationally. Now, I think it was sort of a down year for sacks across the board. I think when you look at the stats nationally, and of course, I just closed that page, but there were only a couple of teams that got to that 50-sack plateau, despite a bunch of teams playing 13, 14, 15 games. There weren't that many teams that got to 50 sacks, where in the past, it's not like there are usually dozens of teams getting 50 sacks, but I feel like sacks were a little bit down last year across the board, and that was the case for Pitt. Now, last year was an improvement over 2023 when they only had 31 sacks. They averaged 2.58 sacks per game, which ranked number 27 nationally on the average sacks per game. That's still good. You're a top 30 pass rushing team, but that's a far cry from where Pitt was for the 4 seasons before that. 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, Pitt never finished lower than 2nd. in sacks per game nationally over that 4-year span. They actually led the country in sacks per game in 2019 and 2022. They had 50-plus sacks each of those 2 years. 2021, they had 54 sacks, but they played 14 games. They averaged 3.86 sacks per game to finish second in the country in sacks per game. 2020, they were second in the country in sacks per game. They averaged more than 4 sacks per game that year, which is a big part of the reason why Rashad Weaver and Patrick Jones were All-Americans. Or flip the script, Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver were All-Americans, which is a big part of the reason that Pitt finished second nationally in sacks per game. So what do they need to get to this year, or maybe more to the point of this video, what is my prediction for what they will get to this year? I went back and forth. Should I predict 50 sacks, or should I predict 3.85 sacks per game? It's pretty much where you need to be. If you can average 3.85 sacks per game, you'll get to 50 sacks, and I that just feels like a good benchmark. You know, like in the grand scheme of things, does it matter if you have 50, 49, or 51? Is there a big difference there? No, but it's kind of like a 1,000-yard rusher, you know, or a 1,000-yard receiver, or 3,000-yard passer. We said these benchmarks that it's like you just feel good about it, you know. And I think somebody pointed out a long time ago, a 1,000-yard rusher in the NFL when they played 16 games, let alone 17, it's not that much on a per game basis. Like 1,000 yards is not all that impressive. You could just have 200 or 300-yard games and probably get to 1,000 yards without really blowing anybody away or knocking anybody's socks off. So, but it's this benchmark that we've just sort of established. So let's go 50 sacks. My prediction is Pitt's defense will put up 50 sacks this year. And that's the end of the video. Good night. Have a good day. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit more about that because it's not so much about the prediction. Just like with yesterday when we talked about how Eli Holstein could get to 3,000 yards and Des Reed could get 2,000 all-purpose yards and Kenny Johnson could get 1,000 receiving yards. It's more about the how. And why does Pitt need them to do that? You know what I mean? Like, what does, if Eli Holstein gets 3,000 passing yards, what does it mean for Pitt? If Desmond Reed gets 2,000 all-purpose and Kenny Johnson gets 1,000 receiving yards, what do those things mean for Pitt? And along with that, how do they get there? How does Eli Holstein get to 3,000 passing yards and 2,000 for Reed and 1,000 for Kenny Johnson? Same question this year on the defense. How does Pitt get to 50 sacks? Last year they were at 41. They played 13 games and they got to 41 sacks, averaged 3.15 sacks per game. How do they up that to 50 and 3.85 sacks per game? Should probably be no surprise. You need more production out of the defensive ends. I thought there was an interesting comparison to 2021. All right, 2021 in some ways lays out the blueprint for how Pitt can get to 50 sacks. That year they had 54 sacks in 14 games. They averaged 3.86 sacks per game. So a little below that, or right around that 3.85, 3.9 threshold that we're talking about. But it's an interesting sort of comparison of that season, of 2021's pass rush to last year's pass rush, in terms of what worked, how they got the numbers they ended up with, and maybe what was missing last year that a year like 2021 had and like a year like 2025 needs. Because in 2021, Pitt got 20 sacks out of the linebackers. Servassier, it was all split up too. It was all spread around. Servassier Dennis had 4, John Patrician had 4.5, Phil Campbell had 4.5, Cam Bright had 3.5. The other linebackers, including Bengali Kamara, who had 2 that year, the other linebackers combined for 3.5. And you end up with 20 sacks for the linebackers, which is actually the number that Pitt's linebackers had last year, you know, with obviously Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles and Braylon Lovelace doing the bulk of the work there, but some other guys chipping in. I think Jordan Bass had 1 or 1.5 or something like that. Pitt's linebackers last season ended up with 20 sacks, which is the same number they had in 2021. Okay, great. Those two teams right on pace with each other. Actually, last year was a little bit ahead because they only played 13 games, right? The differences come with the defensive line because the defensive ends in 2021 produced 20 sacks. Haba Baldonado had 9. Deslin Alexander had 2.5. John Morgan had 5.5. Deion Hayes had 2. Bam Brima had 1. 20 sacks out of the defensive ends, whereas last year the defensive ends only had 15.5. Now, again, you're talking about a game difference. 2021, they played one extra game. Last year, they only played 13 games. But you're talking about 4.5 sack difference. That's a significant amount. You know, the defensive ends just didn't produce enough. Jimmy Scott had 6 sacks. Nate Matlack had 5.5. Sincere Edwards had 3. And that was pretty much the extent of your production. David Ojebwe had 1. Chief Borders had 0.5. Okay, so you end up with 15.5 sacks from the defensive ends. And then, of course, there was also a big separation between those 2 years we're talking about, 2021 and 2024, in the defensive tackle production. Last year, Pitt's defensive tackles had 4.5 sacks. Sean Fitzsimmons, Francis Brew, and Isaiah Neal had 1.5 each. In 2021, the defensive tackles had 13.5 sacks. So 9 more sacks right there. So when you're looking at the difference between last year, where they had 41 sacks, and 2021, when they had 54 sacks, your big differences come on the defensive line, where they had 33.5 sacks in 2021, and last year they had 20 sacks. I mean, that's a huge difference between the 2 years. So how do they make up that difference? How do they improve to get to 50 sacks in 2025? It's got to happen up front. I'm bullish, fairly bullish, on Kyle Lewis, Rasheem Biles, Braylon Lovelace, Jeremiah Marcelin, Cam Lindsey, maybe even Jaden Bonsu. I'm bullish on the linebackers this year keeping up the production. I really am. I mean, 2 of your best players on the team, 2 of your biggest playmakers on defense are back to play outside linebacker. Because remember, in 2021, I mean, Servassier Dennis had 4 sacks. It was all like spread out, but it was all like low numbers, 4, 4.5, 3.5. So Phil Campbell chips in a little bit here and there. John Patrician chips in a little bit here and there. Cam Bright, Servassier Dennis. This year's team, I think, has bigger playmakers. I think Rasheem Biles is a playmaker. Kyle Lewis is a playmaker. And while Braylon Lovelace might take a hit on his stats playing inside, I'm not entirely sure that that's going to happen, because when Pat Narduzzi talked the other day, and he talked about Jeremiah Marcelin, what he talked about is not just Marcelin replacing Lovelace at middle linebacker to give Lovelace a breather, but Marcelin replacing Lovelace at middle linebacker and Lovelace playing outside, which is what he did all year last year. So I think he's got a chance to still get double-digit tackles for loss and 4 or 5 sacks like he had last year. Last year, Braylon Lovelace, I think, had 10.5 tackles for loss and 4 or 4.5 sacks. I think he can match that production. And I don't see any reason why Kyle Lewis or Rasheem Biles will drop off at all. I mean, maybe if teams commit to stopping those guys rushing off the edge, if teams commit to stopping those guys when they blitz, keep in all these extra blockers and things like that, in which case, I think it only opens things up for the defensive ends and the defensive tackles, in addition to cutting down on the number of, pass catching options that go out on the routes. I think Pitt's defense this year can put teams in a pick your poison type of situation. Do you want to commit to shutting down and preventing Lewis and Biles from going off and getting into the backfield and sacking your quarterback 13 times like they did last year? Or do you want to make sure the defensive ends don't go off? Now, if you're looking at history and the precedent, I mean, the linebackers are the biggest threat. So maybe you commit to stopping them and see if the defensive ends can win those battles. I think there's a pretty good chance these defensive ends will take a step forward in terms of production. Like I mentioned, Nate Matlack and Jimmy Scott last year had 11.5 sacks between them. Jimmy Scott actually ended up number 11 among edge rushers in the ACC in pressures, according to Pro Football Focus. He had 40 pressures, and he turned those into 6 sacks, which is 15%. 15% of his pressures resulted in sacks. It's not a good percentage, and I kind of went into it as I was collecting stats for this podcast and some other things I'm going to write. I kind of went into it thinking that we would find out that, everybody who had, like I said, Jimmy Scott had 40 pressures, that the other 10 guys who had more than 40 pressures would all have like way better sack percentages and higher sack totals, but that really wasn't the case. As a matter of fact, of the 10 guys, the 10 other edge rushers in the ACC who had 40 pressures last year, half of them had not fewer sacks than Jimmy Scott, but converted fewer of their pressures into sacks. Like Elijah Roberts at SMU got sacks on 12.5% of his pressures. Ashton Gillott from Louisville, who had a big game against Pitt last season. I think he had 3 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. He only converted 7.8% of his sacks into pressures. Tyler Barron at Miami converted 11.5%. Jasheen Davis at Wake Forest converted 12.2%. Cam Butler at Virginia converted 5.7% of his pressures into sacks. Whereas Jimmy Scott converted 15%. Now, he needs to raise that number. I think, a great percentage would be 20%. If he can even just get around the 17 to 19% range, I think, he's going to end up with 9, potentially 10 sacks, because I think his pressure numbers will go up as well due to the increased attention that's going to be paid to the linebackers and potentially the defensive tackles if they show they can produce. So step 1 here is Jimmy Scott has to get more pressures, even though he was good in that area last year. Like I say, he was 11th in the ACC among edge rushers in pressures. But he also has to convert at a higher percentage. He's at 15% last year. He needs to convert those pressures into sacks closer to 20% and potentially even more than 20%. If he does that, I think you'll see an increase in the sacks there, 3 or 4 maybe from that group, which gets you closer to that 20 sack total that the defensive ends had a year ago. Then you're going to need some improved production from the other guys. And these guys we've talked about a lot, Blaine Spires and Joey Zielinski and Jaden Moore. And I think Moore alone should be able to match, because I think Moore might have the highest ceiling out of any of these guys, should be able to at least match Nate Matlack from last season when Matlack had 5.5 sacks. I think Moore should at least be able to get that number when you look at what he did at Oregon, and we've talked about this a bunch. His production at Oregon, his pass, this is the hardest phrase in football, pass rush win rate. Say pass rush win rate 5 times fast. It's really hard. And I say this as someone who talks about this all the time, and I've talked about this a lot with Jaden Moore, that pass rush, because you want to add the sh sound to the end of pass. So pass rush win rate. Are you trying this right now? When you look at that stat for Jaden Moore, according to Pro Football Focus, on a small sample size, he compares very favorably and is among the best, or was among the best edge rushers in the Big Ten last year, comparing to like some of the guys that, big time names that you would know, Jack Sawyer and Abdul Carter, Mikhail Kamara. Like, he was, again, in an admittedly very small sample size, one of the more effective edge rushers in the Big Ten last season. Project that over a full season, and he could be really, really good and at least match what Matlack did last year with 5.5 sacks and potentially get that number up to 7, 7.5, or 8. I think if Jimmy Scott and Jaden Moore can combine for at least 17 sacks, Pitt is going to hit that 50 sack benchmark, because I think the linebackers will keep up what they did. I'm going to pencil them in for 20 sacks again. I think they could do it. I don't think it's out of the range of possibility. I don't think it's crazy to imagine that. If you then get 17 from Jimmy Scott and Jaden Moore, which is not crazy, I don't think it's crazy to expect Jimmy Scott to convert a little bit more of his to get more pressures and convert just a slightly higher percentage to end up with 9 or 10. And then for Jaden Moore to take what he did in a small sample size and project it over a full season playing against the ACC and get up to 7 or 8. In which case you're going to be at 17. And then you just need the other guys, Blaine Spires, Joey Zielinski, Zach Crothers, Maverick Grazio, whoever. You need those guys to come up with 3. All right, and now you've got 20 sacks from the defensive ends. You've got 20 sacks from the linebackers. You need 10 more sacks to get you to that 50-sack plateau. I think you can probably pencil the secondary in for maybe 2 sacks, maybe 2.5. So you need 7.5 more. Where's that going to come from? Sean Fitzsimmons, Isaiah Neal, Francis Brew, Jasir Whittington. I'm not sure Nick James is the kind of defensive tackle who produces in that way, but Fitzsimmons is, Neal is, Brew is, and Whittington is. And if those 4 guys can combine for 7.5, 8 sacks, this team can get 50 sacks and be, again, one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the country in total sacks and sacks per game. I asked, I forget who it was, Randy Bates maybe, at Media Day last week of, is there sort of an inevitable balance, a yin and yang or push and pull, that if the defensive ends are getting more sacks, then the stats will go down for the linebackers? And he said, maybe. He said, but also, maybe the defensive ends start getting more pressures and getting more sacks, and they have to commit more attention, and that draws attention away from the D tackles or draws attention away from the linebackers, and then those positions are able to capitalize. I think if you look at the model of 2021, where you had this spread of 20 sacks for the linebackers, 20 for the defensive ends, 13.5 for the defensive tackles, that's the kind of model to shoot for. Maybe not with those kinds of numbers. That team played 14 games, and they also had Kalijah Cansey. He's a little bit ridiculous. He had 7 sacks on his own. I just think if you could get, 7 or 8 sacks out of the defensive tackles as a whole, you're going to have a really good shot at that 50-sack plateau, being one of the best teams in the country in total sacks and sacks per game. And all of it should, most importantly, after we've just spent the last 20 minutes talking about numbers, all of it should translate to more effective play on defense, more success on that side of the ball, potentially more turnovers if you're getting those pressures and sacks, and in the biggest picture of all, more wins. So that's a prediction. I think it can happen. Like I think it's totally plausible with this group of players on defense, particularly in the front 7, that they can get to 50 sacks again. So there's your prediction on offense or on defense. I gave you the offensive predictions yesterday. That's the prediction on defense. Book it and lock it. 50 sacks for Pitt's defense in 2025. Write it down. And while you're at it, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com so you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. These daily morning Pitt videos, our weekly live show, press conferences, post-game shows, interviews, all those things, practice highlights, all right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And then go take advantage of the special half off offer at Panther-Lair.com. Get 50% off your first year of the best Pitt coverage right there. Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Appreciate it. Hope you've had a great week so far. We got one more day left. Get some questions in for the mailbag tomorrow, and we will catch up with you on Friday for the Morning Pitt mailbag right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.